If you're a rock when everything is falling apart, but feel a spike of anxiety the moment life gets quiet, you might be someone who finds comfort in chaos. It's a paradox that has fascinated thinkers for centuries. This pattern of self-destruction that seems to defy all logic. It turns out writers like Fyodor Dostoevsky and psychologists like Sigmund Freud understood this dark corner of our minds surprisingly well. They saw that we are creatures of baffling contradiction, often drawn to the very things that will undo us. This is a journey into that contradiction, a look at why we sometimes ruin the good things in our lives, why stability can feel so terrifying, and why we feel that strange, powerful pull toward chaos. It's a pattern that's as subtle as it is destructive. It's the quiet whisper that says, "This is too good to be true." It's the baffling urge to pick a fight after weeks of peace in your relationship. It's that sudden, crushing wave of procrastination right when you're about to succeed at work. On the surface, it makes no sense. Why would anyone sabotage their own happiness? The answer is that our brains aren't always wired for happiness. They're wired for familiarity. And for many of us, what's familiar isn't peace. It's turmoil. This is the core of what people mean by finding comfort in chaos. It's a psychological tendency to feel a strange sense of security in unstable situations. If you grew up in an unpredictable or emotionally intense environment, your nervous system may have learned to operate on high alert. That hypervigilance, that readiness for the next crisis, can become your baseline. It becomes your normal. In that state, your body is awash with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. You know who you are in a crisis. You're the fixer, the survivor, the anchor in the storm. You feel competent, needed, and vividly alive. Then the storm passes. You find a healthy relationship, a stable job. The threat is gone. Logically, this should be a relief, but for a nervous system conditioned for chaos, peace feels alien. It feels like that terrifying silent moment right before the other shoe drops. Your brain might interpret the lack of an external threat not as safety, but as a sign that you must be missing something. The enemy you can see is gone, replaced by one you can't, and that can feel infinitely more terrifying. So what does the brain do? It tries to get back to the state it knows how to navigate. It seeks the familiar pattern. This isn't a conscious choice to ruin your life. It's an unconscious drive to restore a known emotional landscape. You might start overanalyzing your partner's words, hunting for a hidden slight. You might set an unrealistic deadline at work that guarantees failure, just to prove to yourself that you weren't worthy of success anyway. These acts of self-sabotage aren't born from a desire for pain, but from a deep-seated fear of the unknown. You aren't addicted to drama. You're addicted to the predictability of a crisis. You know how to handle an argument. You may not know how to handle unconditional love. In the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud was wrestling with a huge puzzle. His theory of the pleasure principle was built on the idea that we're all driven to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But his office was filled with people who broke that rule. He saw war veterans trapped in nightmares, reliving the horrors of the trenches. He saw children compulsively reenacting traumatic events in their play. And he saw patients who would sabotage their own progress in therapy, repeating the same self-destructive patterns again and again. This wasn't a search for pleasure. It was a compulsion to repeat pain. This observation forced Freud to look beyond the pleasure principle and develop one of his most controversial theories, the death drive. Freud proposed that we have two warring instincts. On one side, there's eros, the life instinct. This is our drive for survival, connection, and creation. But fighting against it he theorized, was an opposing force, thanatos, the death drive. He argued that all living things have an unconscious pull to return to an earlier inanimate state, a drive toward dissolution and stillness. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, published in 1920, Freud moves from clinical observation into open speculation. He asks whether every drive might contain a conservative tendency, an urge to restore an earlier state. Keep this in mind. This same idea will pop up later. Now, it's important to frame this correctly. For most people, the death drive isn't a literal wish for death. Modern psychology doesn't treat it as a biological fact, but as a powerful metaphor for understanding self-destructive behavior. It shows up as aggression, self-sabotage, and a phenomenon Freud called the repetition compulsion. The repetition compulsion is the death drive in action. It's the mechanism that pulls us back to our deepest wounds. Think of it this way. Someone who grew up with a critical parent might consciously seek a warm, loving partner. That's the life instinct eros at work. Yet they might find themselves drawn, again and again, to partners who are emotionally unavailable and critical, recreating the painful dynamic of their childhood. In Freud's view, this is the repetition compulsion, pulling them back to a familiar pain. The psyche, in a twisted attempt to finally master the original trauma, repeats it, hoping for a different outcome. It rarely gets one. This pull toward undoing is the Freudian lens for our topic today. When life is stable and loving, the unresolved tension from our past has no outlet. The quiet of happiness is a void, and the death drive, in its quest to return to a prior state, rushes in to fill it. If Freud gave us the concept of a hidden destructive drive, his one-time student, Carl Jung, gave us its face. Jung believed the human psyche held more than just our personal baggage. It also contained a collective unconscious. And within that landscape, he identified a crucial part of our personality that we all have, but few are willing to meet: the shadow. The shadow is simply everything about ourselves we refuse to see. It's the dark side of our personality, the parts we consider unacceptable or shameful. It's where we store our primitive urges, our greed, our irrational rage, and our envy. As kids, we quickly learn which parts of us get rewarded and which get punished. To fit in, we build a persona, a public mask that shows off our most agreeable qualities. The shadow is everything we shove behind that mask. But here's the thing. Repressing the shadow doesn't make it go away. It just operates in the dark, outside our conscious control. And one of its favorite ways to show up is through projection. Projection is when we unconsciously take our own unacceptable qualities and pin them on other people. As Jung famously said, projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. Ever been irrationally irritated by someone's arrogance? Or found yourself harshly judging a friend for being lazy? According to Jung, that intense, out-of-proportion reaction is a good sign you're projecting your own shadow. You might have repressed your own ambition, arrogance, or your own need for rest, laziness, and now you can't stand seeing it in others. You're essentially fighting your own shadow on the battlefield of another person. So how does this create chaos? The shadow can be the engine behind the sudden, irrational reactions that blow up our lives. When things are going well and life is peaceful, there are fewer external crises to distract us from ourselves. This quiet intimacy can feel exposing. It threatens our carefully constructed persona and allows the disowned parts of us, the shadow, to stir. Imagine someone who has repressed their fear of being controlled. When they get into a stable, loving relationship, their partner's closeness, while consciously desired, might unconsciously trigger this buried fear. The shadow, feeling cornered, erupts. They might suddenly feel suffocated and lash out, accusing their partner of being controlling, the very thing they fear in themselves. The chaos they create pushes the other person away, providing temporary relief from the terrifying prospect of self-confrontation. This is why self-sabotage often feels so baffling. A minor disagreement explodes into a huge fight. A small bit of feedback from a boss is twisted into a total rejection. That's the shadow at work. The chaos is a smokescreen, designed to hide us from the difficult work of looking in the mirror. So far, we've explored the deep, unconscious pulls that draw us to chaos. But sometimes the reason we break things has less to do with a hidden drive and more to do with a very visible fear. The fear that if we climb too high, the fall will destroy us. This is where the work of psychologist Abraham Maslow is incredibly helpful. Maslow is famous for his hierarchy of needs, that pyramid we all learned about in school, and one which we've already studied on this channel. It suggests that we're motivated by a series of needs, starting with the basics, like food and water. Once those are met, we seek safety and security. Above that comes love and belonging, then esteem and respect, and finally, at the very top, self-actualization, the drive to become our best selves. Now think about someone whose childhood was marked by instability, maybe financial insecurity or a chaotic home where love felt conditional. Their psychological blueprint is built on shaky ground. They learn in their bones that the world isn't safe and that good things don't last. Their comfort zone is a state of bracing for loss. Fast forward to adulthood. This person, through hard work, finds success. They have a stable income, a loving partner, and respect at work. They're climbing the pyramid. This should feel great, but instead it's terrifying. This is a phenomenon that some thinkers, like Gay Hendricks, have called the upper limit problem. We all seem to have an internal thermostat for how much success and happiness we believe we can handle. When life exceeds that setting, we often unconsciously do something to bring the temperature back down to our familiar, safe level. For someone with a history of instability, as understood through Maslow's lens, the feeling of stability itself is a threat. The inner monologue isn't one of joy, but of dread. This can't last. When is the other shoe going to drop? The psychological pain of waiting for that disaster can be worse than the disaster itself. So, to regain a sense of control, they trigger the crisis themselves. They sabotage their success. It's a twisted kind of logic. If I'm the one who burns it all down, at least I'm in control of the fire. The failure they create is a painful but familiar home. They'd rather live on the shaky ground they know than risk building a life on a higher floor, where the fear of falling is all-consuming. Maslow described needs as a hierarchy of relative prepotency. When a more basic need becomes sufficiently threatened, it moves forward and begins organizing motivation. Needs do not have to be perfectly completed before higher needs appear. People can love, create, and pursue meaning while hungry, frightened, or lonely. This is where your everyday death drive begins to resemble avalanche dynamics, something we'll study later on this channel. Maslow's idea here and Freud's description of an urge to restore an earlier state seem not only to reflect each other, but also describes another pattern we see all the time in nature. Avalanche dynamics, or as some call it, flow behavior analysis, is the scientific study of the physical processes governing the release, acceleration, motion, and deceleration of unstable masses, or other granular flows like debris, down a slope. Imagine, a grain of sand falls onto a pile. Nothing happens. Another falls. Nothing happens. The pile continues arranging itself around the pressure until one ordinary grain crosses a threshold and produces a cascade. The last grain did not contain the energy of the entire avalanche. It revealed the condition of the pile. The sand, itself, found the load-bearing crack. In other words, the death drive might be compared to a system, like a pile of sand that collapses in upon itself in order to reclaim a point of stability. But besides psychology and physics, we can look into another field for insight: philosophy. We've looked at the psychological roots of self-sabotage, seeing it as a kind of bug in our programming. But what if it isn't a bug? What if sometimes it's a feature? What if our impulse to ruin things is a destructive but profound expression of our own humanity? For this, we have to leave the psychologist's office and enter the world of the 19th century Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. In his 1864 novella, Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky introduces us to the underground man. He's a miserable, retired civil servant who attacks the popular idea of his time: rational egoism. This was the belief that humans are rational creatures who will always act in their own best interest. Utopian thinkers believed if you could just build a perfect society, a crystal palace, where all needs were met, then suffering would disappear. All of human life could be calculated, where 2 + 2 always equals 4. The underground man looks at this vision of a perfect world and scoffs. He argues that the one thing the rationalists forget is our most cherished possession: free will. He declares that a person's greatest advantage isn't a life of predictable comfort, but the freedom to choose their own path, even if it leads straight to suffering. He famously argues that a person, out of sheer perversity, might want something stupid or harmful just to prove that he is a man and not a piano key being played by the laws of nature. He'd create chaos just to feel free. His most famous point is his rebellion against the simple logic of 2 × 2 makes 4. He writes that while 2 × 2 is 4 is an excellent thing, sometimes 2 × 2 makes 5 is a very charming thing too. What he means is that human existence can't be confined to logic. To be human is to be irrational, to have whims, and to sometimes act against our own best interests. He even argues that suffering is the sole origin of consciousness, a philosophical stance suggesting that a life of pure, frictionless comfort would be a kind of spiritual death. This is Dostoevsky's radical contribution. He suggests that self-sabotage isn't always a symptom of trauma. Sometimes it's an act of rebellion. When we feel our lives becoming too predictable, too optimized, a part of us might lash out. We might pick a fight or quit the perfect job, not because we're broken, but because we need to assert our freedom. We're choosing the chaotic, messy freedom of being human over the sterile perfection of the Crystal Palace. These internal dramas don't just disappear when we clock in for work. They follow us into the office and the boardroom, showing up as baffling patterns of workplace self-sabotage. The same forces that can wreck a relationship can just as easily derail a promising career. Think about the classic case of chronic procrastination. An employee has a huge project, a real chance to shine. They're capable, they know the stakes, and they want the success. Yet, they delay, getting lost in trivial tasks, only to produce a rushed, subpar version at the last minute. Is it laziness? Maybe not. From a Freudian perspective, this could be the repetition, compulsion in action. If someone has a deep-seated belief that they ultimately fail, procrastination ensures that the outcome matches their internal story. The anxiety of the deadline is a familiar chaos, preferable to the terror of doing their best work and still facing judgment. Or consider a leader who seems to thrive on chaos. They might be brilliant during a crisis, but become restless and disruptive when things are running smoothly. This leader might instigate unnecessary reorganizations or pit departments against each other, all to recreate the high-stakes environment where they feel most alive and in control. They are addicted to being the indispensable fixer, and if there's nothing to fix, they might just break something. The Jungian shadow also has a seat at the table. A manager who has repressed their own ambition might project it onto their team. They might see a confident, high-performing employee not as an asset, but as an arrogant threat who is after their job. This manager could then unconsciously undermine that employee, denying them opportunities or publicly criticizing their ideas. This creates organizational chaos, all to quiet the manager's own internal conflict. Workplace self-sabotage, then, is rarely about incompetence. It's the personal-made professional. It's the same fear of success, the same pull toward familiar pain, and the same rebellion against predictability, just translated into the language of projects and promotions. Understanding why we sabotage ourselves is a huge first step. But insight alone isn't enough to break the cycle. As Jung warned, the goal is to make the unconscious conscious. But how do you do that when these patterns feel like your destiny? Breaking the cycle requires deliberate, conscious practice. Here are a few practical strategies, many of which align with core principles of mindfulness and cognitive therapy, to start interrupting the pattern. First, play detective. Name the trigger and track the function. Self-sabotage isn't random, it's a triggered response that serves a protective function. The next time you feel that urge to procrastinate or pick a fight, pause. Ask yourself, what happened right before this feeling? Did I get praised? Did I feel especially close to someone? That's your trigger. Now ask, what is this behavior protecting me from? The vulnerability of intimacy? The responsibility of success? By tracking the function, you see the behavior not as a moral failing, but as a misguided coping strategy. Second, learn to separate feeling from fact. Your nervous system might scream danger when you get a promotion. It's vital to acknowledge the feeling without accepting it as reality. You can tell yourself, I am noticing a strong feeling of anxiety, instead of this situation is dangerous. This small shift creates space. This feels unsafe, but the fact is my partner loves me. Or this feels overwhelming, but the fact is I am capable. Third, interrupt with delay. The impulse to self-sabotage feels urgent. The urge to send that angry text or say that hurtful thing is immediate. Your greatest weapon here is time. Institute a mandatory waiting period. Before you react, force a pause. 10 minutes, an hour, a day. This delay interrupts the automatic pathway and lets your rational mind come back online. Often the urge will shrink, and you can choose a better response. Finally, a powerful tool from Jungian thought is to ask shadow questions. When you have a strong negative reaction to someone, turn the question inward. What part of myself that I reject do I see in this person? This practice of withdrawing projections is humbling, but it's one of the best ways to stop using others as a battleground for your own internal wars. Interrupting these patterns is a lifelong practice of awareness and self-compassion. It's about learning to sit in the discomfort of peace and to tolerate the vulnerability of happiness. We started with a simple question. Why do we ruin things when they're finally going well? We've seen that for a variety of deep-seated reasons, stability can feel unfamiliar, exposing, or even dangerous. Our brain, trying to protect us, defaults to the devil it knows. Chaos, for all its damage, is a known quantity. We've survived it before. Peace and happiness? That can feel like uncharted territory. demanding a new version of ourselves we may not trust. But to end the story, there would be to accept that we're just puppets of our past. The real power of these ideas isn't to excuse our self-destruction, but to light up the path toward conscious choice. The journey from insight to practice is the journey from being a character in a story written by your past to becoming its author. It's the daily work of recognizing the pull toward chaos and choosing something else. It's pausing before you send the angry text. It's staying with the discomfort when you want to run. It's learning to trust the quiet, not as the silence before the storm, but as the stillness of a calm sea. This isn't easy work. There will be days when the old patterns feel too strong to resist. But every time you choose to sit with peace for a moment longer, you are rewiring your brain. You are teaching your nervous system that safety isn't a trap, and happiness isn't a prelude to disaster. The ultimate freedom, perhaps, isn't the chaotic freedom to destroy, but the quiet, courageous freedom to build, and to finally allow yourself to live in the beautiful, peaceful house you've constructed. If this exploration resonated with you, consider subscribing for more content that dares to go deeper. This journey of self-discovery is often a solitary one, but it doesn't have to be. Share your own experience with this pattern in the comments below. Reading the stories of others can be a powerful reminder that we are not alone in this complex human struggle. What does your pattern of chaos look like? And what is one small step you can take today to choose peace